ceasefire in Syria is shattered within hours of coming into effect. Hello and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Ghida Fakhry. The temporary truce was brokered by UN and Arab League envoy Lakhdar Brahimi to mark the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Adha. It was hoped that it could serve as a springboard for ending the 19-month-old conflict, but those hopes faded fast. A car bomb exploded in the capital Damascus on Friday morning, and a second went off in front of a church in Deir ez-Zor on Saturday. Activists are also reporting shelling and shooting in Aleppo, the suburbs of Damascus, and Homs. At least 100 people are reported to have been killed since the start of the truce. Stephanie Decker has the latest.
Allahu Akbar!
This is not what a ceasefire looks like. In the outskirts of the capital, this is said to be the aftermath of an attack by a Syrian jet. It's the second day of what was supposed to be a 4-day truce. Any hope that UN and Arab League envoy Lakhdar Brahimi's ceasefire would hold is gone. But then again, there are very few who believe that this conflict can be suspended even for a few days. Brahimi's mission has always been described as impossible, even by the man himself. And there is no indication that he will succeed where his predecessor Kofi Annan failed. It's been more than 18 months since this conflict began, but little has changed. Any gains the opposition makes on the ground, the regime can reverse just as fast from the air. Often the fighting happens street by street and house by house, destroying with it people's lives.
The situation is very, very bad. We're extremely concerned by the humanitarian situation on the ground. Many thousands of people have lost their homes. We were able to deliver assistance, able to deliver some aid. We were able to get to Homs in this last week. As you know, Homs, there's been some very, very heavy fighting there. We were able to deliver some medical supplies there and see for ourselves the extent of the devastation.
Each side accuses the other of violating the truce. But what's clear after so many months of fighting is that no one is willing to compromise. For these fighters, President Bashar al-Assad must go, and they will continue fighting until he does. Stephanie Decker, Al Jazeera.
Now, to discuss the failed ceasefire in Syria, I'm joined by our three guests. From Amman, Ron Redmond, regional spokesman for the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR. From Washington, D.C., Christopher Swift, adjunct professor of national security studies at Georgetown University. And joining us here in Doha, Saleh Mubarak, a member of the Syrian National Council. Mr. Mubarak, judging by the quick breach of this ceasefire, clearly there are too many players in this conflict who feel it is in their interest to continue the fighting. Where does it leave any prospect for peace?
Well, from the beginning, we said that the prospects are close to nil. We were not expecting the regime to honor this ceasefire because, like we say, the regime is damned if accepted, if honored this ceasefire, and damned if not.
But it isn't just the regime. There was also a car bombing in Damascus just a few hours after this ceasefire was announced. Can such a ceasefire ever work when, fine, you've got the two main parties on board, the government and the Free Syrian Army, but you also have a whole array of armed groups without any clear unified chain of command?
That's true. That's true. They are not unified officially under any command, although I would say that there are few commands that said, the consensus among these groups that if the regime stops firing, if the regime stops bombing from air, and some commanders put another conditions of releasing those kidnapped people. We don't like to say arrested because they were not officially arrested, especially the women. They would observe that. So I think that those armed groups do not gain anything by violating the truce, the ceasefire. They would like the people to enjoy the Eid holiday as peacefully as possible.
But do they have any incentive to put down their arms, though? Because judging by some of the statements that have been made by some of their military commanders, they feel they're on the offensive, that they've put the government on the defensive and therefore don't feel any need to have to compromise at this stage.
Well, they're not putting down their arms. It's by definition, truce or ceasefire doesn't mean an end of hostilities. It's just a break out of the violence for 3 days for the Eid. So you're right. They feel they have the upper hand in certain areas, not in all areas. But I don't think they would have a problem in stopping the violence for 3 days.
It still is a temporary cessation of fire. Let me turn to Christopher Swift in Washington, D.C. Has this exercise in a ceasefire, if we can call it that, been a complete failure from where you stand? Or has it, as some people might argue, however oddly it sounds, been somewhat of a successful first step in that it opened the lines of communication, at least with some of the main sides, that it got them to agree, at least publicly, to this ceasefire, even if it wasn't respected for very long?
Well, look, the answer to that question is both are true, right? The ceasefire has been a failure. Within 4 hours of the ceasefire going into effect, there was evidence of sniping and the regime moving tanks deeper into resistance territory and resistance reprisals. Now we have this large bombing in southern central Damascus. So from a military standpoint, the ceasefire has been a failure. That's very disappointing. It's in fact heartbreaking, but it's not surprising. Look, the simple fact of the matter is regimes like this don't agree to a ceasefire unless they think it's in their interests, and the same is true for resistance movements. The fact that they did agree, however, does suggest that there's room for politics. Look, there are 3 things that happened this week that are very interesting. The first is the Syrian regime agreed, which means they must have felt it was in their interest to do so. The second is the rebels, or the majority of the resistance, agreed, which must have meant that they thought it was in their interest to do so. And the third thing is, as soon as the Syrian regime's air force came out of the skies, the Syrian people came back out onto the streets to protest. Now, all 3 of those things tell me that there's still space for politics in Syria. There's still space for keeping the discussion going. And just because people are fighting does not mean that some diplomacy should not be moving forward. If we don't have those contacts, if we don't try to develop them and develop confidence between the 2 sides over time, this conflict's just going to spiral out of control.
Mr. Redmond, with the ceasefire being so short-lived, was there ever a window of opportunity that allows your teams on the ground to have access to some of the major areas of Idlib, Homs, Aleppo?
It has been a mixed picture. On Thursday, we were able to get some convoys out and delivering supplies in and around Aleppo. We also delivered to Homs. Today we had about a dozen trucks that were able to head toward Homs. We also delivered south of Hasaka and also to Al Raqqa. These were, in some cases, trial runs. We'll try to send more supplies tomorrow. Unfortunately, today we were unable to deliver to the Aleppo, Idlib area as we had planned because of insecurity. So it's a mixed picture.
And are these humanitarian operations to help some of these refugees being hindered simply by the ongoing violence, by the instability, or is there also a major concern about the lack of funding of some of these operations?
Well, there is a lack of funding. Right now, we're about 29% funded in the countries around Syria for our operations for refugees, and we've got 360,000 registered refugees outside Syria, so that's hampered. Inside Syria, the operations are continuing, but there are also logistical problems that are not related to security, things like lack of fuel. In fact, some of the trucks today that were heading out of Hasaka up in the northeast were unable to find diesel fuel, so they were delayed for a number of hours. They're out there now. Communications are also not so good in some of these areas, and we're still waiting for confirmation that some of these trucks have arrived.
Saleh Mubarak, you heard about the dire situation facing some of these very many refugees inside Syria and those who've been lucky enough, if lucky is the right word, to cross the border onto one of the neighboring countries. In the light of this, where does the Syrian National Council stand when it comes to the kind of solution that is needed? Do you see there as being a military solution as the Free Syrian Army does, or is there a political solution?
The Syrian National Council is actually doing a lot of work for the refugees. I know the expectations from some people are a lot more than what we can do, but we are limited in funding, we're limited in power. The solution now, the move to the Syrian National Council, as you know, it's going to have its conference here in Doha on November 4th, between 4th and 7th. What we're trying to do is augment this council and include more members of the opposition who were not originally in this SNC. And the objective is to have a consolidated opposition that will result, hopefully, in a government, in temporary government for the Syria that will represent officially the Syrian people and will get the recognition of the countries around the world.
But why is it taking you so long, though? Where is the political opposition? Because many people would argue the only real player is the Free Syrian Army. You've had a common goal, common purpose now for close to 19 months to bring down this government, and still you don't seem to have been able to dovetail your position, to coalesce and form a united front. What will it take?
Well, there is exaggeration on one side in how the opposition is not united. We are united in the goal, which is to get rid of this regime with all its symbols. However, this is revolution. This is not a coup d'etat. This is wasn't planned. So, and this SNC, by the way, is only 13 months old. Is not the revolution is 19 or 20 months old, but the SNC was established in September of last year.
But what happens, though, beyond bringing down this regime? What happens if and when the Assad government does fall? Because some of your major backers, some of the Europeans, the United States, have serious concern about what happens next, whether or not there could be that modicum of unity that will allow you to govern when and if that happens.
Well, there is an agreement among all parties that future Syria will be a free country with democracy, where all people will be, allowed to vote and choose their system. So when we have a discussion on whether it's going to be secular, whether it's going to be Islamic or this, we don't like to entertain this discussion because we said who we are to decide on behalf of 23 million Syrians. It's going to be decided in the ballot boxes. And furthermore, I would tell you, the Syrian people are the farthest from all other nations from extreme views. So I think the future government would be very much mainstream, a mixture, a coalition, if you will. There is no dominant party, I can tell you for sure. But
there are already extreme views on there. Christopher Swift, in Syria, among some of these armed factions, and I know you've done quite a bit of research on these types of groups over the last few years. The Free Syrian Army leadership admits it doesn't control all the rebel units fighting the government. My question to you is, how much of a challenge are groups like Al-Nusra, which are widely believed to be allied with Al-Qaeda?
Well, look, this is a civil war, and a civil war is very different from a conventional war between two countries or two large armies. A civil war, this particular one, is being fought by the regime against the population, and it's also being fought by the resistance up from within the population. And as a result, it's going to be very complicated. It's probably going to take a very long time, and it's likely to be very nasty. The other consequence of this type of conflict is that spoilers or extremists have the ability to have more influence by being willing to use more types of terrorist violence or violence against civilians, be it to provoke people on one side or the other, be it to sustain the conflict because they see it as serving their interests. Here's the really critical question here. When we're looking at the various groups fighting in the resistance in Syria, we have to identify what their political objectives are, not what their political ideologies are, because the ideology, as our guest and friend here mentioned earlier, can be sorted out in the ballot box. But the political interests are really fundamental here. If people are focused on removing the Assad regime and establishing an alternative to it, that's one set of objectives. But if people are interested in using Syria as a base for promoting extremism and maintaining a degree of anarchy in Syria, then that's a completely different set of objectives. And the resistance has got to be very, very clear in their mind about who they're going to collaborate with and who they're going to isolate. The short-term security imperative can't undermine their long-term political objectives, especially when it comes to Al-Qaeda-linked groups.
How much of a unified political objective, though, can there be between these very disparate groups when you have apparently quite a few foreign armed groups crossing in from neighboring countries who sometimes don't have very much in common, do they, with the Syrian groups fighting on the ground who want to bring down the government but for their own vested interests?
Yeah, the foreign fighter phenomenon is a pretty troubling one. I haven't seen hard numbers. I think there's been some over-exaggeration in terms of their degree, their size and their degree of influence. But I know it's a major concern here in the United States, partially because some of these groups are coming out of Iraq. Some of these groups are moving across North Africa and coming from other places. And these are groups that don't necessarily have the long-term interests of the Syrian people in mind, because they're waging an ethical battle. And that's very different from a political battle. So at a certain point, the Free Syrian Army, the Syrians and the resistance who care about their country are going to need to draw some pretty clear distinctions between their objectives and the objectives of these foreign fighters. You know, but at the moment we're involved in a very, very messy civil war, and it's very hard to get people to put their short-term security concerns aside long enough to deal with their long-term political concerns. That's the nature of war, that's the difficulty of war, and that's part of the reason why, even if they're not successful, efforts like the ceasefire have to go forward, diplomacy has to go forward, so the parties are talking with one another.
And it is this situation that is leading a lot of humanitarian aid and relief groups to warn of a looming refugee crisis in Syria, especially this winter. The United Nations Refugee Agency says there are some 360,000 registered Syrian refugees, but it's warning that number could almost double by the end of this year. Now, most refugees have been taken in by Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon and Iraq, but it's feared there could be tens of thousands more who are not officially registered. Ron Redmond, how many more are potentially not registered, and how much of a burden can some of these neighboring countries absorb?
Well, the numbers, you can double the number of registered, and you'll probably be in the region, particularly since last week the Egyptian Foreign Ministry announced that they estimate they've got some 150,000 Syrians in Egypt. Less than 7,000 Syrians are actually registered in all of North Africa. So there's a huge number of Syrians who've fled since this conflict began, just to Egypt alone. So these numbers are huge, and they're growing. Jordan could have another 100,000. Turkey says it's got 70,000 outside of the camps, where they've got 100,000. Lebanon says it has tens of thousands extra. So the numbers are big, and now we've got winter coming, and we really desperately need to get everything in place so that these people can weather this winter cold. The governments themselves, in most cases, are stretched to the limit, and that's why we are urging the international community not to leave this burden solely on the shoulders of these governments, which have been extremely generous. And don't forget, they also hosted in Jordan and elsewhere, they hosted hundreds of thousands of Iraqi refugees as well. So the international community has to pitch in here and show some burden sharing and some solidarity.
And as you say, some of these countries have been generous in taking in tens of thousands of refugees, even though the conditions in which these refugees live in are far from ideal. Obviously, they're also suffering from some of the conditions they find themselves in, particularly in Jordan. You've talked a little earlier about the level to which the United Nations humanitarian appeal is underfunded. I wonder how important it might be for some of the wealthier Gulf countries who support the rebels, the armed factions in the country trying to bring down the government. How important would it be for them to also financially try to alleviate the suffering of the refugees?
Well, we are receiving support from various Gulf countries, which, as a matter of fact, in the Zatre refugee camp north of Amman, up near the border, it's a tent camp. There are some 30,000 or less refugees in that camp. They're living in tents. They're going to face a very difficult winter, but the Gulf states are providing prefabricated container shelters. Those are being shipped in now. We've already erected about 300 of those. Each one of those will hold a family. So we are getting support from this region as well, but we need a lot more, and we need more from all donor governments, and we need it quickly.
Well, you just heard Saleh Mubarak about the urgent need for help. and for something to be done urgently to help those suffering the most, the refugees, mostly the women, the children who've had to leave the country. So looking again at the kind of solution that might be offered, the one that you and the Syrian National Council may be able to push for, what would you see the nature of that being? Or will we simply see more fighting on the ground, all sides trying to wear themselves down and wear each other down militarily before they end, because they all feel that victory might be in sight?
Well, if you remember, when the revolution started, there was no slogan about overthrowing the government. All what they want is a little bit of freedom. And the answer came from the government, very swift, shooting and killing and so on. The regime has proven day after day that it has absolutely no room for freedom. It's going to be governing by iron fist no matter what. So the regime did not give any space. Now I think after all these 40,000 plus killed and all the suffering, it would be a shame to accept any compromise that will allow the regime or any of its elements to stay. So the regime has to, I think the battle here should be...
You put all the onus on the regime, but was there enough goodwill on the other side? Because we heard from Free Syrian Army commanders who said before the ceasefire even took place, they said that it was dead before it even started. How much goodwill was there for political dialogue?
Right. That was an expectation, knowing the nature of your enemy. And I want to go back a little bit, and I agree with the assessment of the gentleman from Washington completely, and I want to add something to it, that I would blame the West, and in particular the US, for allowing us to reach that point when for 5-6 months there was no armed resistance at all. It was peaceful from the people, but not peaceful from the regime. And then the Free Syrian Army started forming. At the early stages of the Free Syrian Army, we looked, it was very disciplined, and it was all professional soldiers. We know who they are, no foreign fighters whatsoever. And we went to the West and we said, we need to arm those people under your, under some kind of agreement. It was, and we said all the time, we don't need any foreign fighters. We have Syrian fighters who are under this Free Syrian Army, but we need some weapons to, we couldn't resist, for example, the air bombardment. We did not have any, weapons that will resist that. And we were willing to open all the, books to our allies. But because of, we denied the particular weapons we asked for, this escalated and exacerbated all the population, and then we started having those kind of groups.
Mr. Swift, how do you react to this kind of accusation that the blame should be pinned in large part on the West, on the US, for not acting quickly enough and supporting the rebels fast enough and providing them with what they needed to take on the government?
Right. Well, I don't speak for the US government. I'm an independent scholar and attorney, so I can't speak to what was or was not said in the US government's negotiations.
It's a fair accusation, though?
Look, I think the United States government, I think Europe, I think the Arab League and many others could have done a lot more, a lot sooner. I don't think the blame rests exclusively with the United States. I also think that there is a difficulty in this sort of war that it's going to attract sort of the wandering jihadi. We see this phenomenon in Libya. We've seen this phenomenon in many other places, including Yemen, where I was over the summer. People are moving around to where they can find conflicts to participate in. So the notion that we could prevent foreign fighters from going across the border by having, some sort of change in the recent past is a little bit troubling to me. What I can tell you is that generally these sorts of wars escalate in the manner in which my friend from the Free Syrian Army has mentioned, and these wars escalate because the hedgers leave, they become refugees. The defectors defect, they join the other side, or they get out of the conflict altogether. And the spoilers, the people who have an interest in keeping the conflict going, gain more power. We've seen this happen in Iraq. We saw it happen with the Russian intervention in Chechnya. The longer these sorts of wars are allowed to continue, the more personal it becomes, the more the bloodshed becomes systemic and endemic, the more likely it is for extremists to gain the upper hand.
On this note, let me thank all of my guests for joining us. From Amman, that was Ron Redmond. From Washington, D.C., Christopher Swift. And here in the studio with me, Saleh Mubarak from the Syrian National Council. And thank you very much, as always, for joining us on this edition of Inside Syria. You can find all our coverage on Syria on our website. That's at aljazeera.com. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team, thanks for watching.